haunting tale. It started as a rumour, whispered among friends over beers at the local dive bar. Just an urban legend, one of those scary stories people tell to freak each other out late at night around the campfire. That's all it was at first, a creepy narrative to get a few goosebumps and nervous laughs. But then people started experiencing strange things after hearing the tale. Subtle things at first, strange noises in the night, glimpses of movements out of the corner of their eye, unexplained shadows, things that could perhaps be dismissed as an overactive imagination or fatigue playing tricks. But the occurrences grew more frequent, more disturbing, until people started wondering if there was something more sinister at work. The story was known simply as the haunting tale. As it was passed from person to person, friend to friend, the details grew hazier and the narrative more unsettling. But the core premise remained the same, that telling or hearing the haunting tale opened up a doorway that could never be closed again, inviting malicious paranormal forces to enter your life. Jenny Marsters was one of the first to hear the cursed story. It was a crisp autumn evening, and she was walking home from her waitressing job at the 24-hour diner downtown when her friend Amy called out to her from across the dimly lit street. "Hey Jen, wait up. I've got a crazy story to tell you." They ducked into a nearby alleyway, pulling their jackets tight against the brisk wind. Amy's eyes danced with a mix of excitement and unease as she launched into the tale in a hushed, conspiratorial tone. "Okay. So you know my cousin Rob, who works at that old record store downtown. Well, he told me about this story that's been going around, and strange things have been happening to people after they hear it." Jenny felt a tremor of fear as Amy recounted the haunting tale in haunting detail. It was a disturbing narrative involving a young woman tormented by the restless spirit of her abusive ex-boyfriend who was killed in a drunken hit-and-run accident years earlier. His ghost began appearing to the woman in the weeks after the tragic incident, at first only peripherally, as a dark figure glimpsed from the corner of her eye. But soon, the spirit's appearances became more overt, more aggressive, as he transitioned from silent spectre to something much more sinister and menacing. According to the tale, it didn't stop with the woman either. Once the malevolent entity gained a foothold into the physical world through the woman's anguished grief and unresolved guilt over her ex's death, it began tormenting others who crossed paths with the story as well. Like an insidious virus, the haunting spread from person to person through any retelling of the disturbing narrative, almost as if by speaking the words aloud gave the evil spirit the power to manifest. "So yeah, crazy, right?" Amy said once she'd finished relaying the story, snapping Jenny out of the trance-like state it had lulled her into. "Rob says people around town have been reporting all kinds of freaky stuff happening after hearing that tale. Things moving around on their own, strange sounds at night, feeling like they're being watched. One person even said they saw a dark figure out of the corner of their eye just like in the story." Jenny shivered, a chill skittering down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. "You really think there's anything to it? Or is it just a dumb ghost story people are getting freaked out over?" Amy shrugged, attempting a casual nonchalance that didn't quite ring true. "Who knows? But Rob seemed pretty spooked by it, and you know how skeptical he normally is about paranormal stuff. Figured it was just too crazy not to share." Looking back, Jenny realized that was the precise moment the malignant force first insinuated itself into her life, a silent shadow creeping into the deepest recesses of her subconscious mind. In the days and weeks that followed, she started noticing little things, half-glimpsed shapes flitting through her peripheral vision, objects askew when she could have sworn she'd left them properly aligned, a pervasive sense of being watched even when alone. Occurrences she wrote off as tricks of dim lighting or a mind addled by lack of sleep. But the strangeness only escalated from there. She awoke from troubling nightmares, confusion gripping her as she struggled to separate dreams from reality. Whispers seemed to beckon from the shadows, indistinct murmurings just beyond the cusp of comprehension. Cupboard doors swung open inexplicably, picture frames rattling on walls with no explicable source of vibration. At first, Jenny fought against acknowledging the possibility that anything supernatural was at play. She was a practical, level-headed woman who dealt in cold rationality and solid facts. She had no patience for ghost stories or paranormal bunk. There had to be some logical explanation for the bizarre occurrences, her mind reasoned. But try as she might, no amount of justification could reconcile the profoundly disturbing manifestations she began witnessing in the days after hearing the haunting tale. Like some breadcrumb trail of degrading sanity, the events grew progressively more menacing and undeniable. A week after hearing the story, she was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of her apartment. She searched every room in a panicked frenzy, but found no source, no intruder, no evidence anyone else was present. But the scream had been so visceral, so drenched in stark terror, that it made her own heart gallop with second-hand fright. 2 nights later, an unmistakable figure materialized in her bedroom doorway, blocking the path to the living room in an impenetrable silhouette. Just a fleeting glimpse as she turned over in a half-awake state, but it lacerated her unconscious mind like a razor blade, the distinct outline of a man, more substantial and defined than a mere trick of shadows and light. She blinked, and it was gone, but she knew what she'd seen. Then came the writing on the wall. Literally. One morning she was greeted by a chilling message scrawled across her bathroom mirror in what looked glaringly like blood. "Get out." The smeared letters burned themselves into her retina, seeming to sear through her fragile sense of reality. How could such a thing be possible? More importantly, what sinister force had brought it into existence, and what did it want from her? She half convinced herself it must have been some sick prank, someone breaking into her apartment as a twisted joke. But a part of her, a deepening dread she could no longer suppress, recognized the unmistakable hands of something supernatural at work. By that point, with her mind whipped into a frenzied cyclone of fear, the connections were inescapable. The strange occurrences, so seemingly innocuous at first but escalating towards outright danger with each passing day, all traced back to one source, her learning of the ill-omened haunting tale from Amy's own cursed lips just weeks earlier. Jenny wasn't alone in her inexplicable torment either. As word of the chilling story continued spreading through the small community like a plagued whisper, she caught wind of others experiencing similar unexplained terrors. Her co-worker Melinda confided that she was being plagued by night terrors so visceral and disturbing they made her afraid to sleep. She spoke of a rotting corpse figure clawing towards her from the shadows, its sunken eyes brimming with hatred and malice, a gurgling rattle of breath carrying the putrid stench of decay. Though she awoke with a jolt each time, clawing at her own throat in panic, she could never quite shake the lingering remnants of that horrifying dream presence. Then there was the local mailman, who had earned quite a reputation for his loud, inappropriate jokes and sexist comments around the office lunchroom. But the cheerful, crude jokester had recently devolved into a paranoid shut-in after something seemed to snap within him, whispering feverishly about evil spirits from the other side, hell-bent on vengeance and retribution. Most disturbing of all were the disappearances. Within a month, 3 people had vanished without a trace, their last known contact being with someone who had spread the haunting tale. First was Jenny's friend Amy herself, the one who had kick-started Jenny's own nightmarish odyssey by passing the cursed story along to her. No one had seen or heard from Amy in over 2 weeks. Then a college student at the nearby university, a bright and popular young man at the cusp of a promising future. According to friends, the normally level-headed intellectual had been acting increasingly unhinged and paranoid in the weeks before his disappearance, raving about evil forces pursuing him after he read about the haunting tale online. The third was an elderly woman from the community knitting circle, a sweet if slightly kooky grandmotherly type. One day she simply never returned home from her weekly meeting at the park with her closest friends. The women she met with every Thursday claimed she had been recounting a terrifying supernatural story in the moments before she abruptly got up from the picnic blanket, mumbled something about getting away, and wandered off alone, never to be seen again. With each additional instance, each new attack of the malevolent force stalking those familiar with the haunting tale, Jenny felt the vice-like grip of paranoia wrapping tighter around her fraying psyche. She could no longer trust her own senses, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Was this all really happening, or was she merely losing her grip on reality? Had she opened herself up to something inexplicably evil by allowing those haunting words to pass Amy's lips all those weeks ago? Jenny knew she had to get to the bottom of whatever malevolent forces were at work, for her own sanity, if nothing else. She began hitting the library books and devouring any information she could find on the paranormal, desperate for an answer, a solution, to break the seemingly supernatural hold being exerted upon her and whoever else had fallen prey to the haunting tale's curse. What she discovered was as unsettling as it was tantalizing. Reams of ancient texts and archaic references to obscure paranormal phenomena involving certain rituals and incantations that, once spoken or even merely heard, supposedly opened gateways to the spirit realm. Some sources claimed these entrances offered escaped evil entities the power to physically manifest and strike back in retaliation against the living plane, while most of the archaic writings dismissed such spirit realm tales as mere myth and superstition. She found enough eerie parallels to modern-day accounts of hauntings and unexplained paranormal assaults to give her pause. Could the haunting tale, with its unsettling narrative of violence and untimely death, be rooted in some kind of ancient supernatural ritual designed to summon malicious spirits across the veil between worlds? Jenny gathered as much information as she could. If there really was some dark metaphysical power at work, she needed to understand its origins and weaknesses. Only then could she hope to stop the malignant force before it was too late. As she burrowed deeper down the paranormal rabbit hole, the tales she uncovered only grew more disturbing. She discovered references to certain ancient cultures performing occult rituals to appease the restless souls of those who died prematurely due to violence or tragedy. These lost souls, their thirst for vengeance left brutally unslaked, were believed to metamorphose into powerful, hell-bent force of darkness, feasting on the anguish and suffering of the living. If such revenant entities managed to pierce the veil separating worlds, their only aim was to spread their hateful brand of spiritual disease like a festering plague, torturing and claiming as many living souls as possible before being vanquished. And certain types of violence or death-related incantations, passed from person to person, only empowered them further by reinforcing their ties to the physical realm. Was that what was happening here? Had the haunting tale, with its narrative of abuse, murder, and otherworldly vengeance, tapped into some primordial occult evil that was now being unleashed upon anyone who dared hear its words? Armed with her newfound research, Jenny started digging deeper into the origins of the haunting tale itself, desperate to find the source that first unleashed the malignant forces now terrorizing her community. What she uncovered was even darker than she could have imagined. The story, it seemed, had first been recounted in the 1970s by members of an isolated cult deep in the forests of northern Georgia. The cult had been attempting to perform an ancient ritual to summon the vengeful spirit of a teenage girl who had been brutally murdered by a rejected lover years earlier. Their aim was to feed off the dark energy and use it to achieve immortality and unbridled power in the physical realm. According to the cult's encrypted journals and recordings, The ritual involved speaking aloud a stylized calling, a narrative account reliving the vicious murder and the young woman's anguished, vengeful final moments. This calling, which grew to be known as the haunting tale, was meant to tear open a rift between worlds, providing a conduit for the murdered girl's restless spirit to access the living plane. The cult members believed that by ingratiating themselves to this malevolent entity, demonstrating their reverence and offering the sacrifices it craved, they could feed off its darkness like a preternatural battery of infinite life force. But the ritual quickly went awry in ways the deranged cult leaders could never have fathomed. Rather than a controlled spiritual harvesting, the haunting tale's incantations seemed to rip open a Pandora's box of evil, unleashing the murdered girl's fury upon the world in an unstoppable tempest of violence and terror. The haunting force they'd foolishly hoped to harness and subjugate shrugged off its mortal shackles like wisps of smoke. It ripped through the cult compound in a feverish rampage, mutilating and destroying any living thing in its path in a graphic descent into bloodshed and depravity. By the time the deadly curse had run its course, the entire cult lay strewn in tattered, desiccated heaps, their bodies ravaged and broken beyond recognition. But the haunting's dark legacy, its malicious sentience, lived on through the disturbing narrative the cult's leaders had recited to originally summon it. The self-same tale, now burning its way through Jenny's community like a ravenous cancer. Whoever heard or recounted the story, no matter how long after the fact or how disconnected from the original ritual, was subjecting themselves to that hateful spectre's torment. The more Jenny uncovered about the horrific origins of the haunting tale and the havoc it wrought when first unleashed, the more petrified she became. She finally knew the truth behind the chilling events plaguing her waking life. This was no mere ghost story, but the reign of an ancient, unfathomable darkness bent on harvesting living souls and leaving only mutilated remnants in its wake. And she, by the cruel twists of fate and a friend's innocent retelling, had painted a merciless target on her own back. She could feel the haunting's vile presence growing stronger with every fresh retelling of the dreaded narrative, its reach stretching further like a burgeoning virus seeking new hosts to consume. There was no telling how many others had been afflicted by its curse since that first ill-fated cult ritual decades earlier. If Jenny didn't act quickly to break the haunting's insidious hold, not only would her own soul be consumed, but the ravenous entity could potentially escape into the world at large through other hapless hosts. It could usher in an endless night of unchecked torment and spiritual destruction, the likes of which the world had never seen. She had to find a way to sever the haunting's ties to the physical realm, no matter the risk or personal cost. Jenny began feverishly cross-referencing her paranormal research, desperate to find an occult solution, some long-forgotten ritual or protective incantation that could repel and contain the powerful evil she had unwittingly helped unleash. She knew going in blind could prove cataclysmic against such an ancient, virulent force. After agonizing nights spent poring over esoteric texts amid the haunting's escalating psychological assaults, she landed on a ceremonial binding ritual described in a medieval occult grimoire. Designed to neutralize and entrap malicious supernatural entities, the ritual involved inscribing hyperdimensional locking runes at the 4 cardinal points around the tormenting spirit's cross-plane emanation source, reinforced by chanted incantations and channeled bio-spiritual energy. It was the grimoire's only depicted solution for higher-level hauntings, intrusions by maleficent forces that had transcended simple, localized paranormal activity. The book warned of grave risk and potentially devastating consequences if performed incorrectly or without adequate preparation. But Jenny knew she was already living a terrifying nightmare. At this point, inaction was the bigger gamble. She just needed to discern the site of the haunting's origination point, the spatial location acting as its current dimensional anchor to the physical world. Following the text's archaic clues, she deduced that it had to be at the coordinates of the ill-fated cult ritual from the 1970s that first unleashed the entity, the haunting's unholy genesis point. Armed with the ancient grimoire's exacting specifications, she obtained the materials and prepared to journey into the forest wilderness and attempt the binding ritual at the site of the cult's massacre. Under cover of night, Jenny trekked deep into the foreboding Georgia woodlands towards the ritual coordinates she'd pinpointed from the old cult records. The forest felt ominous and unwelcoming, as if the haunting's spectral presence had seeped into the very air and trees themselves. More than once she could have sworn she glimpsed inky black figures trailing her from the shadowed tree line, always just outside her direct field of vision, but thrumming with palpable malice. At last she arrived at a mossy ravine, the exact location specified in the cult's records as the site of the original ritual and subsequent bloodbath nearly 50 years earlier. Already Jenny could sense a heaviness in the air, an intangible psychic weight pressing down like a vice around her temples. This was the place. Working by the grimoire's flickering candlelight, she carefully etched the prescribed protection runes in blessed salts and rendered fats around the ravine's perimeter, while chanting the ritual verses in a language so ancient it predated written etymology. The words felt strange and unwieldy on her tongue, their primordial consonants and guttural inflections bottling up in the back of her throat until she eased into the rhythmic flow of their dark, strangely melodic cadence. All the while, she could feel a malignant force gathering in the void around her, an insidious static charge violently repelled by the ritual's mystic conduits. It started as a whisper in her mind, faint and fleeting, the ghostly beckoning of a woman's dying rasp. But as Jenny continued stoking the ritual's eldritch fires through her chanted invocations, the haunting's manifestations became increasingly bold and terrifying. Skeletal hands, gnarled and charred from some unspeakable psychic immolation, cawed at her from the shadows, their fleshless digits charred barbs scrambling for purchase. Bestial roars echoed from non-existent muzzles, surrounding her from all sides with the thunderous shrieks of damned, tormented souls. And always, hovering behind it all like a puppet master watching its defiled marionettes, was the haunting's epicenter, the malevolent, all-consuming darkness that had been plaguing Jenny and her entire community. This was no wispy spectre or mere ghost, but a fathomless pit of vengeful evil, hungering to swallow the very fabric of reality. As Jenny inscribed the ritual's final protective seal, she felt the entity's full perverse weight come crashing against her aura like a runaway freight train, its fury awakened and summoned forth into the physical plane. A towering shadow mass, blotting out the night sky itself, reared towards her with outstretched tendrils, the haunting's truest, most abhorrent form unleashed. Girding her soul against the relentless onslaught, Jenny completed the ritual's culminating litany just as she felt her corporeal body coming undone by the haunting's corrosive presence. With a last cry of defiance, she manifested the binding seals into a prismatic barrier of eldritch energy, piercing the shadow mass's nucleus at its multidimensional nexus. The haunting's furious wails reverberated with enough decibel force to shatter steel as its essence fractured, bifurcated, and rapidly collapsed inward upon itself. For one suspended moment, all became silent and calm, as if the world had frozen at the catalyst of some higher cosmic reckoning. Then, with prismatic energies lashing in every direction, the haunting's omnidimensional cross-plane form imploded in an apocalyptic burst, banished instantly back into the ether between realities from whence it manifested. When Jenny finally came to from the ritual's violent exertion, she found herself alone in the ravine's cratered epicenter, the binding seal's residual traces still flickering kaleidoscopically across her shaking palms. The haunting essence had been purged, its corrupted anchor to the material plane severed, She alone remained to bear witness to its excision. Though physically and psychically drained from channeling such antediluvian forces, she felt an overwhelming wave of catharsis and relief wash over her. The malignant curse she'd been living under, the shadow of dread that had followed her every waking moment, was lifted. At long last, the haunting had been contained. In the days and weeks that followed, reports of paranormal phenomena throughout the community began subsiding as suddenly as they had begun. Those still haunted by the entity's spectral residue, their minds left addled by its psychological torment, gradually recovered and reintegrated into normal life. It was as if a menacing spiritual fog had finally lifted, leaving those afflicted by the haunting tale to blink in the reassuring light of an existence no longer held hostage by primordial dread. For Jenny, the scars would never fully heal. She had glimpsed and challenged a darkness that shattered the boundaries of mortal perception. The rituals and occult lore she had confronted reshaped her understanding of reality itself into something more ominous and infinite than she could have ever imagined. But at least now the ancient malignant force responsible for so much torment and anguish had been locked away, quarantined behind closed cosmic dimensions where it could no longer feed upon the fears of the living. Her role had been that of the line's last defense against a greater evil most would never know existed, let alone encounter in their lifetimes. In the end, Jenny honored the magnitude of her harrowing journey in the only way that felt appropriate, by chronicling the full account of the haunting tale's origins, manifestations, and ultimate binding in a detailed dossier she entitled The Residual Report. She documented every excruciating detail and archaic occult ritual, preserving the knowledge in case such an unholy breach between realms ever threatened humanity again. But she took great care to keep the actual disturbing narrative of the haunting tale itself separate and siloed, both from the report's contents as well as the outside world. Much too dangerous to allow such a malignant Genesis story to ever spread again unchecked like a cursed virus. The residual report itself would remain sealed in an underground occult vault, accessible only to a clandestine circle of world paradoxologists and spiritual custodians. Fragmented, untranslated excerpts might surface centuries or even millennia later as obtuse allusions to some manner of eldritch torment in esoteric appendices. But the haunting tale's full, virulent essence would rest eternally interred, like the sealed metaphysical Pandora's box it was, preserved as a stark warning to any amateur occultist deluded enough to pry into such profane mysteries. As for the malevolent haunting force itself, which had manifested as cruel irony from a well-intentioned ghost story's retelling, it would remain locked away indefinitely, like its own twisted spectre encased within the infernal abyss, a supernatural Grendel too powerful and perverse to ever be suffered into the light of mortal realms again. The seal had been locked and reinforced, for now. But there would always remain that haunting dread that one day, perhaps eons hence when Earth and humanity were scattered cosmic dust, some foolish or ill-fated voice might accidentally whisper those accursed syllables anew, and if so, the ancient haunting would claw its way back from oblivion, tearing open fresh portals to resume its insatiable quest across planes and dimensions innumerable. For on a cosmic scale, what is the sum lifetime of a single planet's populace, or even the race that spawned it, when compared to the immortal hunger of a force that has tormented and been tormented since before the stars were born? No ritual, no matter how steeped in eldritch power, can cage such malefic sentience forever. The haunting always lives on, lying in wait. That is simply its deathless nature, to eternally haunt the planes between reality until the final utter reckoning of all existence.